Hello, welcome back to another video tutorial here at GeekatPlay Studios. My name is Gary Miller. I've got a fun project today, which is UV mapping a car tire. And if you think about it, a car tire is, well, it's a cylinder. And this tutorial is different from all my other UV mapping tutorials because in all of those, all I've ever UV mapped are objects that are essentially cubes, squares, rectangles, that sort of thing. There's a different process that we need to utilize here in Hexagon when we unwrap objects that are more spherical and certainly organic in their shape and construction. So let's get started. I'm going to come up here to cylinder, create a cylinder. I'm going to create 3 sections here. And the reason why I'm going to create 3, I will explain as we get further along in this. And just to make this simpler for me, I'm just going to create 20 points right here. And I'm going to close the ends up. Now I think if you were making this tire for yourself for a model, yeah, well, you definitely want more points along here. It kind of looks like a Flintstone tire. It's a little crude, but it's just for the ease and simplicity of creating this tutorial. Okay, with my select faces enabled, I'm going to select both sides of my object, come over here to sweep surface, and I'm just going to essentially just make a tire profile here. Very basic. In fact, this isn't even a tutorial on how to create a tire. It's just a tutorial on how to unwrap it, which is far more, or can be far more work than creating it. Creating it can be easy. But if you're not familiar with the process of unwrapping something in this type of shape that's cylindrical or rounded, that can be very frustrating. Okay, so I'm done with my tire. That looks fine. I'm going to come over here to a split screen, and now I've got my UV layout here. If you don't, then click on whatever this says. It might say perspective, front, rear. You want to come down here and have a UV layout. I'm not going to come over here and use the UV and paint tab because all of the only tools that I'm going to be needing are right here, which is the disassociate UV and the unfold. Well, in order to unfold an object like this, we need to use the pins and seams feature that Hexagon provides. And the best way to explain it is by demonstrating it. So I'm going to click on this little head right here, which allows me to unfold it and brings up the properties box. And the first thing I want to do is click on my select edges, and over here I've got 2 choices, seams or pins. If I select edges, it automatically chooses the appropriate selection, which gives me seams. If I select points, it comes over and chooses pins. Well, I'm going to start off first with seams. And a seam is essentially just like a seam in a pair of pants or a shirt. It's where 2 pieces of clothing joined together or stitched together. And just like on our object here, everything where all the joints where the polygons connect are seams. Well, we need to unstitch essentially this object so that we can lay it out flat and in a symmetrical manner so that we can then take our UV map over into Photoshop and create a tire texture. Now, let me bring up my pin here. The best way that will be the most efficient is to be able to take our UV map, lay it out in a flat and symmetrical manner, very similar to what I'm doing here, so that when we bring it into Photoshop, we've got a nice rectangular map that will make it very easy to create a texture on. And the only way we're going to get our UV map to be laid out in this fashion is to create a cut right down the middle, not of the object, but of its UV mesh. Then once we create a cut or a seam, then we need to unwrap one half that direction, unwrap the other half in the other direction, lay it out flat, and it will take on this sort of appearance here. And none of the tools in the UV paint, none of the traditional projection modes or tools will allow us to do that, only working with seams and pins. So just to get things started, I'm just going to randomly select a seam, an edge. And to make it easy for me, I'm going to grab this top one here. I'm going to loop it. So now it loops all the way across the top. I'm going to press the plus button, which will add it to my selection. In fact, if I come over here, back into this window, you can see this dark blue line. That tells me that that is the selection, or at least one of the selection of seams that I have generated so far. All right, now we need to create a selection of pins. So I'm going to select that edge right there. I'm going to loop it, come up here to selection, and convert selection to points. I need to select these points. Now I could do it manually, click on each one, but I found it easier just to use the select edges and loop it. Okay, with this selection of points now, I'm going to add it to my list, add it to my projection over here. Now I'm sure you noticed immediately when I added that selection of pins over here by clicking on the plus button, Hexagon already unwrapped this for me. But even in this current state, it's fairly unusable, and it won't allow us to texture it, create a texture map very easy over in Photoshop. This is going to be a lot of work. In fact, I wouldn't even bother with it. But this is the best we can do so far, so I'm going to go ahead and click Validate. If you look at this, Hexagon has tried to do a pretty good job of unwrapping this. But if we zoom in, this little point right here is a sticking point. It's preventing the program from unwrapping this and laying it out flat like I drew down here in my earlier demonstration. And we've got to get it laid out flat. So the best way to do so is I'm going to come up here to select points. I'm going to right click and drag a selection around those 2 points. Now let me click off for a second. If you notice, this is these are points where all these vertices come together. That makes sense. But watch what happens when I create a selection around it. They're selected. What I want to do now is I want to disassociate it. Now, disassociating is simply it's disconnecting these points that I have selected. So as soon as I hit disassociate UV, watch what happens. Well, now I've got 3 points down here. What is Hexagon doing? What do these points mean? Essentially, these points that I had earlier selected are 2 points. They're overlapping. They're connected to one another. When I disassociated it, it gives me these points here, this lower one and this top one. And what that allows me to do, it allows me to select one or the other so that I can manipulate them, move them around if I want. So if I want to manipulate the top one, I'll simply click on it, and now I can move it anywhere I want. If I wanted to play with the bottom one, then I would select that, and that's all that's doing. Okay, so those points are disconnected right now, but the UV mesh doesn't look any better. All we need to do is come back up here, select edges, select that edge right there, loop it one more time. Actually, I need to come back to UV unfold. Select that edge, loop it one more time, add it to our selection, and notice immediately now the thing is unwrapped nice and flat like I demonstrated or illustrated earlier. There are some problems with it. It by no means is perfect in its current state, so we're going to need to do a little bit of work on there. I'm going to hide my perspective view. I don't need to look at my tire anymore. I'm finished with that. I'm going to come over here, and change the orientation or the projection of this UV mesh so that I can get a better choice of starting points. With the mesh projected along the x-axis, this is what it gives us. If I change it to y, well, that's the results that it gives us, and z, those are the results it gives us. And at first glance, they kind of look all the same, but there's a little trick here, something that will be a considerable time saver. If you notice this square right here, this polygon that I'm outlining, it's fairly large. As the mesh goes further to the left, it tapers down noticeably, where these down here are much smaller than the ones over here. That will give us a lot of problems and create a whole lot of work when we take this unwrapping phase into its next level. So I don't want the UV mesh to look like this as it's projected across along the x-axis. So let's come over here to y. Y looks pretty good, except the squares up here are noticeably larger than the ones down there. So that's not going to work for us either. Let's try Z. That's not going to work for us either. What I'm going to do is come back to X, but pinning axis, I'm going to change that to V. Now look at it. Now these cubes, at least to my eye, are all the same size as they come across. I guess it's a little bit larger here in the center, so let's try a different projection. We've got the pinning axis set along the V. Let's change it to Y. Let's change it to Z. Oh, forget Z. Let's come back to Y. This is, the Y looks to be the best so far. Let's check out X again. Doesn't look much different. Come back to the U. Yeah, these are noticeably different, so that's not going to work for us. Z, no. Okay, I'm going to come to the V and check out the projection axis along the Y. I like that. Well, I can definitely work with that. I'm going to validate that. What I want to do now is we've got it laid out flat, but it's still kind of unusable, because if you know anything about the way textures are projected onto objects, they're going to follow the texture will follow the contour of this UV mesh. And if we created a texture and applied it to our tire now, it will be very distorted. What we need to do is we need to straighten out every single one of these edges. And this will take a few minutes, but it's rather quick and it's rather painless, and it just goes very easy. So I don't know, turn on your music player and listen to iTunes and follow along while I do this. What I want to do is I want to create a selection of any one of these. It doesn't matter which one. I'll start here at the end. I'm going to hit L to loop that. Now what I want to do is straighten this out so that it's perfectly, or at least as perfect as I can make it, perfectly vertical. And the best, easiest way to do that is I'm going to bring the scale slider that's located along my U axis, or along the X axis here, and I'm going to bring it and straighten it out. Now notice, the further out I get, the more distorted it is on both sides. But no matter how distorted it is, if I come right to the middle, it's perfectly straight. I'll show you on this next one. Select that, hit L, bring the slider right down to the middle. It's perfectly straight. I'll come over here to this end. I'll hit L, come right to the middle. It straightens it out perfectly. And that's what I'm going to do for this. It takes just a few minutes, but the results are well, very good. Now, you're probably thinking, well, this is a lot of manual work. Aren't there any programs out there that all you have to do is create an object and press a button and it will read my mind and lay the UV map out exactly how I want to? Isn't there a program that just does it and does it right the first time? Well, yes and no. There are lots of programs out there that allow you to lay out your UVs, and usually the more expensive the program, the better tools that are available. But even so, with even some of the best programs, you still need to go in and do a little manual tweaking just to get things exactly how you want. And in actuality, this really doesn't take all that much time at all. Okay, so we're done with the vertical ones. Let's come over here to the horizontal, select that top edge, L to loop it, and I'm just going to bring it down, flatten it out, flatten that out, and it goes along fairly easy. Certainly nothing complicated. And as long as you bring the scale slider and stop right in the middle there, you're assured some really good, accurate results with this. Now, here's why, and you'll see in the next tutorial even better, but here's why I created that, when I created this cylinder, why I created it with 3 sections. I wanted this section right down the middle. And the reason I wanted it down the middle is that when we're done here, which will be in about 3 seconds, when we're done here, I want to know, without having to guess, where the center is of this mesh. Well, shoot, just create a line down the middle here and let Hexagon tell me where the center of it is, rather than look at my UV map in Photoshop and have to approximate where it is. As it is now, this line here is perfectly in the center of my mesh. Well, we are done with this. I'm going to save this, save as tire. Now what I need to do is save my UV map. And this is something that you may have already thought of, but my computer monitor is a widescreen monitor. And as such, I want to take advantage of that fact. So when I lay this out and I'm finished, I want the UVs to be horizontal. I want it laid out in this fashion. I don't want it laid out in this fashion because in actuality I have less screen size to work with. This is about all I can do to zoom in to see my entire mesh. If I lay it out this way, I can zoom in much further, and that will allow me, when I get into Photoshop, to be able to see more of this mesh pattern, and will make it a little bit easier to create a texture to put on it. And that's just going to make my life a little bit easier. So I want my UV mesh to be laid out in a landscape type orientation. Now, in looking at this, it's not absolutely perfect. Some of these center cubes here, or polygons, are larger than some of these on the outside. And if you want to change that, it's very simple. Just make a selection and drag outwards. Just like what I'm doing here. And the results will be just a little bit better, which is always beneficial when you're creating a model. Alright, so we are done with this. The last thing I need to do now is save this as a UV map so we can bring it into Photoshop, and we'll be doing that on the next tutorial. So let me save this out. I'll call it UV tire map. Save it on my desktop, and we are done, and we'll see you on the next tutorial. So thanks for watching this tutorial here at GeekatPlay Studios. My name's Gary Miller. Have a good day.